Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining me again here as we continue reading Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. We'll get into it in just a moment, but before we do, I'd like to kind of give the same warning I've been giving with each of these episodes on this particular book. And it's particularly important for me to report it right now because we're definitely in the section of the book where this is most likely to come up. And that is that C.S. Lewis, while he is a great author and a well-known sort of amateur theologian, is ultimately a product of his time. And what I mean by that is that he does occasionally express views, particularly on homosexuality and on kind of women, the place of women, if you will, that we would find completely unacceptable in the modern day. And there are those that feel that that if anyone has ever expressed an objectionable view, that everything they've done needs to be cancelled. That it's all been negated. I do not agree with this, especially when we're looking at people who live in very different eras, in very different society than we live in today. And while both in the UK, where C.S. Lewis is from, and here in the US, we would probably, most of us find these particular views to be, at the very least anachronistic, at worst highly objectionable, that it was kind of normal for the time period that he lived in. I still think that this book has a lot of good things to give thought to, that help you think about, if you are a Christian, help you think about your own beliefs, and if you're not a Christian, kind of gives you interesting insight into the thought processes of at least one person who went from atheism to Christianity. That's C.S. Lewis, by the way. So I just want to warn that I'm not going to censor things. I'm not going to gloss over the fact that he may have expressed such objectionable views. I will read what he has written. If those views come up in what we read today, I will discuss them after the fact. So that's kind of the basic warning. Before we get into it, I would like to proceed with our poem today. As you know, we start each episode with a poem. Today's poem is by George Marion McClellan, and it is called A Butterfly in Church. What dost thou here, thou shining, sinless thing, with many-colored hues and shapely wing? Why quit the open field and summer air to flutter here? Thou hast no need of prayer. 'Tis meet that we, who this great structure built, should come to be redeemed and washed from guilt. For we, this gilded edifice within, are come with erring hearts and stains of sin. But thou art free from guilt as God on high. Go, seek the blooming waste and open sky, and leave us here our secret woes to bear, confessionals and agonies of prayer. So again, that was A Butterfly in Church by George Marion McClellan. So now let us go ahead and dive right in to Mere Christianity this week, or this episode. You will remember that we are currently in Book 3. The overall book is divided into 4 books, and each book has multiple chapters. We are in Book 3, which is entitled Christian Behavior, and we are this week reading 2 chapters. This is quite important that I gave you that little speech about C.S. Lewis, because these 2 chapters to me sound like the ones that are most likely to have some of those kind of comments, but we will see. Those objectionable views might be expressed. So the first chapter, chapter 5, is called Sexual Morality. We must now consider Christian morality as regards sex, what Christians call the virtue of chastity. The Christian rule of chastity must not be confused with the social rule of modesty, in one sense of that word, i.e., propriety or decency. The social rule of propriety lays down how much of the human body should be displayed and what subjects can be referred to, and in what words, according to the customs of a given social circle. Thus, while the rule of chastity is the same for all Christians at all times, the rule of propriety changes. A girl in the Pacific Islands wearing hardly any clothes and a Victorian lady completely covered in clothes might both be equally modest, proper, or decent, according to the standards of their own societies. And both, for all we could tell by their dress, might be equally chaste or equally unchaste. Some of the language which chaste women used in Shakespeare's time would have been used in the 19th century only by a woman completely abandoned. When people break the rule of propriety current in their own time and place, if they do so in order to excite lust in themselves or others, then they are offending against chastity. But if they break it through ignorance or carelessness, they are guilty only of bad manners. When, as often happens, they break it defiantly in order to shock or embarrass others, they are not necessarily being unchaste, but they are being uncharitable, for it is uncharitable to take pleasure in making other people uncomfortable. I do not think that a very strict or fussy standard of propriety is any proof of chastity, or any help to it, and I therefore regard the great relaxation and simplifying of the rule which has taken place in my own lifetime as a good thing. At its present stage, however, it has this inconvenience that people of different ages and different types do not all acknowledge the same standard, and we hardly know where we are. While this confusion lasts, I think that old or old-fashioned people should be very careful not to assume that young or emancipated people are corrupt whenever they are, by the old standard, being improper. And in return, that young people should not call their elders prudes or Puritans because they do not easily adopt the new standard. A real desire to believe all the good you can of others and to make others as comfortable as you can will solve most of the problems. Chastity is the most unpopular of the Christian virtues. There is no getting away from it. The Christian rule is either marriage with complete faithfulness to your partner or else total abstinence. Now this is so difficult and so contrary to our instincts that obviously either Christianity is wrong or our sexual instinct as it is now is gone wrong. One or the other. Of course, being a Christian, I think it is the instinct which has gone wrong. But I have other reasons for thinking so. The biological purpose of sex is children, and just as the biological purpose of eating is to repair the body. Now, if we eat whenever we feel inclined and just as much as we want, it is quite true most of us will eat too much, but not terrifically too much. One man may eat enough for 2, but he does not eat enough for 10. The appetite goes a little beyond its biological purpose, but not enormously. But if a healthy young man indulged his sexual appetite whenever he felt inclined, and if each act produced a baby, then in 10 years he might easily populate a small village. This appetite is in ludicrous and preposterous excess of its function. Or to take it another way, you can get a large audience together for a striptease act. That is, to watch a girl undress on the stage. Now suppose you come to a country where you could fill a theater by simply bringing a covered plate onto the stage and then slowly lifting the cover so as to let every one see, just before the lights went out, that it contained a mutton chop or a bit of bacon. Would you not think that in that country something had gone wrong with the appetite for food? And would not anyone who had grown up in a different world think there was something equally queer about the state of the sex instinct among us? One critic said that if he found a country in which such striptease acts with food were popular, he would conclude that the people of that country were starving. He meant, of course, to imply that such things as the Striptease Act resulted not from sexual corruption, but from sexual starvation. I agree with him that if, in some strange land, we found that similar acts with mutton chops were popular, one of the possible explanations which would occur to me would be famine. But the next step would be to test our hypothesis by finding out whether, in fact, much or little food was being consumed in that country. If the evidence showed that a good deal was being eaten, then, of course, we should have to abandon the hypothesis of starvation and try to think of another one. In the same way, before accepting sexual starvation as the cause of the striptease, we should have to look for evidence that there is, in fact, more sexual abstinence in our age than in those ages when things like the striptease were unknown. But surely there is no such evidence. Contraceptives have made sexual indulgence far less costly within marriage and far safer outside it than ever before, and public opinion is less hostile to illicit unions and even to perversion than it has been since pagan times. Nor is the hypothesis of starvation the only one we can imagine. Everyone knows that the sexual appetite, like our other appetites, grows by indulgence. Starving men may think much about food, but so do gluttons. The gorged, as well as the famished, like titillations. Here's a third point. You find very few people who want to eat things that really are not food, or to do other things with food instead of eating it. In other words, perversions of the food appetite are rare. But perversions of the sex instinct are numerous, hard to cure, and frightful. I'm sorry to have to go into all these details, but I must. The reason why I must is that you and I, for the last 20 years, have been fed all day long on good, solid lies about sex. We've been told, till one is sick of hearing it, that sexual desire is in the same state as any of our other natural desires, and that if only we abandon the silly old Victorian idea of hushing it up, everything in the garden will be lovely. It is not true. The moment you look at the facts and away from the propaganda, you see that it is not. They tell you sex has become a mess because it was hushed up. But for the last 20 years it has not been. It has been chattered about all day long, yet it is still in a mess. If hushing up had been the cause of the trouble, ventilation would have set it right. But it has not. I think it is the other way around. I think the human race originally hushed it up because it had become such a mess. Modern people are always saying sex is nothing to be ashamed of. They may mean two different things. They may mean there is nothing to be ashamed of in the fact that the human race reproduces itself in a certain way, nor in the fact that that way gives pleasure. If they mean that, they are right. Christianity says the same. It is not the thing, nor the pleasure, that is the trouble. The old Christian teachers said that if man had never fallen, sexual pleasure, instead of being less than it is now, would actually have been greater. I know some muddle-headed Christians have talked as if Christianity thought that sex or the body or pleasure were bad in and of themselves, but they were wrong. Christianity is almost the only one of the great religions which thoroughly approves of the body, which believes that matter is good, that God himself once took on a human body, that some kind of body is going to be given to us, even in heaven, and is going to be an essential part of our happiness or beauty and our energy. Christianity has glorified marriage more than any other religion. Nearly all of the greatest love poetry in the world has been produced by Christians. If anyone says that sex in itself is bad, Christianity contradicts him at once. But of course, when people say sex is nothing to be ashamed of, they may mean the state into which the sexual instinct has now got is nothing to be ashamed of. If they mean that, I think they are wrong. I think it is everything to be ashamed of. There is nothing to be ashamed of in enjoying your food. There would be everything to be ashamed of if half the world made food the main interest of their lives and spent their time looking at pictures of food and dribbling and smacking their lips. I do not say you and I are individually responsible for the present situation. Our ancestors have handed over to us organisms which are warped in this respect. And we grow up surrounded by propaganda in favor of unchastity. There are people who want to keep our sex instinct inflamed in order to make money out of us, because, of course, a man with an obsession is a man who has very little sales resistance. God knows our situation. He will not judge us if we had no difficulties to overcome. What matters is the sincerity and perseverance of our will to overcome them. Before we can be cured, we must want to be cured. Those who really wish for help will get it, but for many modern people, even the wish is difficult. It is easy to think that we want something when we do not really want it. A famous Christian long ago told us that when he was a young man, he prayed constantly for chastity. But years later he realized that while his lips had been saying, "O Lord, make me chaste," his heart had been secretly adding, "But please don't do it just yet." This may happen in prayers for other virtues too, but there are 3 reasons why it is now especially difficult for us to desire, let alone to achieve, complete chastity. In the first place, our warped natures. The devils who tempt us and all the contemporary propaganda for lust combine to make us feel that the desires we are resisting are so natural, so healthy, and so reasonable that it is almost perverse and abnormal to resist them. Poster after poster, film after film, novel after novel associates the idea of sexual indulgence with the ideals of health, normality, youth, frankness, and good humor. Now, this association is a lie. Like all powerful lies, it is based on a truth, the truth acknowledged above that sex in itself, apart from the excesses and obsessions that have grown around it, is normal and healthy, and all the rest of it. The lie consists in the suggestion that any sexual act to which you are tempted at the moment is also healthy and normal. Now this, on any conceivable view and quite apart from Christianity, must be nonsense. Surrender to all our desires obviously leads to impotence, disease, jealousies, lies, concealment, and everything that is the reverse of health, good humor, and frankness. For any happiness, even in this world, quite a lot of restraint is going to be necessary. So the claim made by every desire, when it is strong, to be healthy and reasonable counts for nothing. Every sane and civilized man must have some set of principles by which he chooses to reject some of his desires and to permit others. One man does this on Christian principles, another on hygienic principles, another on sociological principles. The real conflict is not between Christianity and nature, but between Christian principles and other principles in the control of nature. For nature, in the sense of natural desire, will have to be controlled anyway, unless you're going to ruin your whole life. The Christian principles are admittedly stricter than the others, but then we think you will get help towards obeying them, which you will not get towards obeying the others. In the second place, many people are deterred from seriously attempting Christian chastity because they think, before trying, that it is impossible. But when a thing has to be attempted, one must never think about possibility or impossibility. Faced with an optional question in an examination paper, one considers whether one can do it or not. Faced with a compulsory question, one must do the best that one can. You may get some marks for a very imperfect answer. You'll certainly get none for leaving the question alone. Not only in examinations, but in war, in mountain climbing, in learning to skate or swim, or in riding a bicycle, even in fastening a stiff collar with cold fingers, people quite often do what seemed impossible before they did it. It is wonderful what you can do when you have to. We may indeed be sure that perfect chastity, like perfect charity, will not be attained by any merely human efforts. You must ask for God's help. Even when you have done so, it may seem to you for a long time that no help or less help than you need is being given. Never mind. After each failure, ask forgiveness. Pick yourself up and try again. Very often what God first helps us towards is not the virtue itself, but just this power of always trying again. For how important chastity or courage or truthfulness or any other virtue may be, this process trains us in habits of the soul, habits of the soul which are more important still. It cures our illusions about ourselves and teaches us to depend on God. We learn on the one hand that we cannot trust ourselves even in our best moments, and on the other, that we need not despair even in our worst, for our failures are forgiven. The only fatal thing is to sit down content with anything less than perfection. Thirdly, people often misunderstand what psychology teaches about repressions. It teaches us that repressed sex is dangerous, but repressed here is a technical term. It does not mean suppressed in the sense of denied or resisted. A repressed desire or thought is one that has been thrust into the subconscious, usually at a very early age, and can now come before the mind only in a disguised and unrecognizable form. Repressed sexuality does not appear to the patient to be sexuality at all. When an adolescent or an adult is engaged in resisting a conscious desire, he is not dealing with a repression, nor is he in the least danger of creating a repression. On the contrary, those who are seriously attempting chastity are more conscious and soon know a great deal more about their own sexuality than anyone else. They come to know their desires as Wellington knew Napoleon, or as Sherlock Holmes knew Moriarty, as a rat catcher knows rats or a plumber knows about leaky pipes. Virtue, even attempted virtue, brings light. Indulgence brings fog. Finally, though I have had to speak at some length about sex, I want to make it as clear as I possibly can that the center of Christian morality is not here. If anyone thinks that Christians regard unchastity as the supreme vice, he is quite wrong. The sins of the flesh are bad, but they are the least bad of all sins. All the worst pleasures are purely spiritual. The pleasure of putting other people in the wrong, of bossing and patronizing and spoiling sport and backbiting, the pleasures of power and of hatred. For there are two things inside me competing with the human self which I must try to become. They are the animal self and the diabolical self. The diabolical self is the worst of the two. That is why a cold, self-righteous prig who goes regularly to church may be far nearer to hell than a prostitute. But of course, it is better to be neither. Then we come to chapter 6. That was the end of chapter 5 about sexual morality. Chapter 6 is called Christian Marriage. The last chapter was mainly negative. I discussed what was wrong with the sexual impulse in man, but said very little about its right working. In other words, about Christian marriage. There are two reasons why I do not particularly want to deal with marriage. The first is that the Christian doctrines on this subject are extremely unpopular. The second is that I have never been married myself and therefore can speak only at second hand. But in spite of that, I feel I can hardly leave the subject out in an account of Christian morals. The Christian idea of marriage is based on Christ's words that a man and wife are to be regarded as a single organism, for that is what the words one flesh would be in modern English. And the Christians believe that when he said this, he was not expressing a sentiment, but stating a fact. Just as one is stating a fact when one says that a lock and its key are one mechanism, or that a violin and a bow are one musical instrument. The inventor of the human machine was telling us that its two halves, the male and the female, were made to be combined together in pairs, not simply on the sexual level, but totally combined. The monstrosity of sexual intercourse outside of marriage is that those who indulge in it are trying to isolate one kind of union, the sexual, from all other kinds of union, which were intended to go along with it and make up the total union. The Christian attitude does not mean that there is anything wrong about sexual pleasure any more than the pleasure of eating. It means that you must not isolate that pleasure and try to get it by itself, any more than you ought to try to get the pleasures of taste without swallowing and digesting, by chewing things and spitting them out again. As a consequence, Christianity teaches that marriage is for life. There is, of course, a difference here between different churches. Some do not admit divorce at all. Some allow it reluctantly in very special cases. It is a great pity that Christians should disagree about such a question, but for an ordinary layman the thing to notice is that the churches all agree with one another about marriage a great deal more than any of them agrees with the outside world. I mean, they all regard divorce as something like cutting up a living body, as a kind of surgical operation. Some of them think the operation so violent that it cannot be done at all. Others admit it is a desperate remedy in extreme cases. They are all agreed that it is more like having both your legs cut off than it is like dissolving a business partnership or even deserting a regiment. What they all disagree with is the modern view that it is a simple readjustment of partners to be made whenever people feel they are no longer in love with one another or when either of them falls in love with someone else. Before we consider this modern view in its relation to chastity, we must not forget to consider it in relation to another virtue, namely justice. Justice, as I said before, includes the keeping of promises. Now, everyone who has been married in a church has made a public solemn promise to stick to his or her partner till death. The duty of keeping that promise has no special connection with sexual morality. It is in the same position as any other promise. If, as modern people are always telling us, the sexual impulse is just like all our other impulses, then it ought to be treated like all our other impulses. And as their indulgence is controlled by our promises, so should its be. If, as I think, it is not like all our other impulses, but is morbidly inflamed, then we should be specially careful not to let it lead us into dishonesty. To this someone may reply that he regarded the promise made in church as a mere formality, and never intended to keep it. Whom then was he trying to deceive when he made it? God? That was really very unwise. Himself? That was not very much wiser. The bride or bridegroom or the in-laws? That was treacherous. More often, I think the couple, or one of them, hoped to deceive the public. They wanted the respectability that is attached to marriage without intending to pay the price. That is, they were impostors. They cheated. If they are still contented cheats, I have nothing to say to them. Who would urge the high and hard duty of chastity on people who have not yet wished to be merely honest? If they have now come to their senses and want to be honest, their promise already made constrains them, and this, you will see, comes under the heading of justice, not of chastity. If people do not believe in permanent marriage, it is perhaps better that they should live together unmarried than that they should make vows they do not mean to keep. It is true that by living together without marriage they will be guilty, in Christian eyes, of fornication, but one fault is not mended by adding another. Unchastity is not improved by adding perjury. The idea of being in love is the only reason for remaining married. The idea that being in love is the only reason for remaining married really leaves no room for marriage as a contract or promise at all. If love is the whole thing, then the promise can add nothing. And if it adds nothing, then it should not be made. The curious thing is that lovers themselves, while they remain really in love, know this better than those who talk about love. As Chesterton pointed out, those who are in love have a natural inclination to bind themselves by promises. Love songs all over the world are full of vows of eternal constancy. The Christian law is not forcing upon the passion of love something which is foreign to that passion's own nature. It is demanding that lovers should take seriously something which their passion of itself impels them to do. And of course the promise made when I am in love and because I am in love to be true to the beloved as long as I live commits me to being true even if I cease to be in love. A promise must be about things that I can do, about actions. No one can promise to go on feeling in a certain way. He might as well promise never to have a headache, or always to feel hungry. But what, it may be asked, is the use of keeping two people together if they are no longer in love? There are several sound social reasons. To provide a home for their children, to protect the woman, who has probably sacrificed or damaged her own career by getting married, from being dropped whenever the man is tired of her. But there is also another reason of which I am very sure. though I find it a little hard to explain. It is hard because so many people cannot be brought to realize that when B is better than C, A may be even better than B. They like thinking in terms of good and bad, not of good, better, and best, or bad, worse, and worst. They want to know whether you think patriotism is a good thing. If you reply that it is, of course, far better than individual selfishness, but that it is inferior to universal charity, and should always give way to universal charity when the two conflict, they think you are being evasive. They ask what you think of dueling. If you reply that it is far better to forgive a man than to fight a duel with him, but that even a duel might be better than a lifelong enmity which expresses itself in secret efforts to do the man down, they go away complaining that you would not give them a straight answer. I hope no one will make this mistake about what I am now going to say. What we call being in love is a glorious state, and in several ways good for us. It helps to make us generous and courageous. It opens our eyes not only to the beauty of the beloved, but to all beauty and its subordinates. It subordinates, especially at first, our merely animal sexuality. In that sense, love is the great conqueror of lust. No one in his senses would deny that being in love is far better than either common sensuality or cold self-centeredness. But as I said before, the most dangerous thing you can do is to take any one impulse of our own nature and set it up as the thing you ought to follow at all costs. Being in love is a good thing, but it is not the best thing. There are many things below it, but there are also many things above it. You cannot make it the basis of a whole life. It is a noble feeling, but it is still a feeling. Now, no feeling can be relied on to last in its full intensity, or even to last at all. Knowledge can last, principles can last, habits can last, but feelings come and go. And in fact, whatever people say, the state called being in love usually does not last. If the old fairy tale ending, they lived happily ever after, is taken to mean they felt for the next 50 years exactly as they felt the day before they were married, then it says what probably never was nor ever would be true, and would be highly undesirable if it were. Who could bear to live in that excitement for even 5 years? What would come of your work, your appetite, your sleep, your friendships? But of course, ceasing to be in love need not mean ceasing to love. Love in this second sense, love as distinct from being in love, is not merely a feeling. It is a deep unity, maintained by the will and deliberately strengthened by habit, reinforced by, in Christian marriages, the grace which both partners ask and receive from God. They can have this love for each other even at those moments when they do not like each other, as you love yourself even when you do not like yourself. They can retain this love even when each would easily, if they allowed themselves, be in love with somebody else. Being in love first moved them to promise fidelity. This quieter love enables them to keep the promise. It is on this love that the engine of marriage is run. Being in love was the explosion that started it. If you disagree with me, of course you will say, he knows nothing about it, he is not married. You may quite possibly be right, but before you say that, make quite sure that you are judging me by what you really know from your own experience and from watching the lives of your friends, and not by ideas you have derived from novels and films. This is not so easy to do as people think. Our experience is colored through and through by books and plays and the cinema. I'm just going to turn this light on here real quick. Oh, so you can see my face better. There you go. Where was I? Sorry. Our experience is colored through and through by books and plays in the cinema, and it takes patience and skill to disentangle the things we have really learned from life for ourselves. people get from the books the idea that if you have been married, the right person, you may expect to go on being in love forever. As a result, when they find that they are not, they think this proves that they have made a mistake and are entitled to a change, not realizing when they have changed, the glamour will presently go out of the new love, just as it went out of the old one. In this department of life, as in every other, sorry, I lost my place here for a moment. There we go. As in every other, thrills come at the beginning and do not last. The sort of thrill a boy has. I'm just going to try and just forgive me for a moment. I'm just trying to adjust the camera here a little bit. Oh, well. Okay, well, I guess I can't. So, sorry about that. All right, sorry about that. The sort of thrill a boy has at the first idea of flying will not go on when he has joined the RAF and is really learning to fly. The thrill you feel on first seeing some delightful place dies away when you really go to live there. Does this mean it would be better not to learn to fly and not to live in the beautiful place? By no means. In both cases, if you go through with it, the dying away of the first thrill will be compensated for by a quieter and more lasting kind of interest. What is more, and I can hardly find words to tell you how important I think it is, it is just the people who are ready to submit to the loss of the thrill and settle down to the sober interest who are then most likely to meet new thrills in some quite different direction. The man who has learned to fly and become a good pilot will suddenly discover music. The man who has settled down to live in the beauty spot will discover gardening. This is, I think, one little part of what Christ meant by saying that a thing will not really live unless it first dies. It is simply no good trying to keep any thrill. That is the very worst thing you can do. Let the thrill go. Let it die away. Go on through that period of death into the quieter interest and happiness that follow, and you will find you are living in a world of new thrills all the time. But if you decide to make thrills your regular diet and try to prolong them artificially, they will all get weaker and weaker and fewer, and you will be a bored, disillusioned old man for the rest of your life. It is because so few people understand this that you find many middle-aged men and women maundering about their lost youth at the very age when new horizons ought to be appearing and new doors opening all around them. It is much better fun to learn to swim than to go on endlessly and hopelessly trying to get back the feeling you had when you first went paddling as a small boy. Another notion we get from novels and plays is that falling in love is something quite irresistible, something that just happens to one like measles, and because they believe this, some married people throw up the sponge and give in when they find themselves attracted by a new acquaintance. But I'm inclined to think that these irresistible passions are much rarer in real life than in books, at any rate when one is grown up. When we meet someone beautiful and clever and sympathetic, of course we ought, in one sense, to admire and love these good qualities. But it is not very largely in our own choice whether this love shall or shall not turn into what we call being in love. No doubt if our minds are full of novels and plays and sentimental songs, and our bodies are full of alcohol, we shall turn any love we feel into that kind of love, just as if you have a rut in your path, all the rainwater will run into that rut, and if you wear blue spectacles, everything you see will turn blue, but that will be our own fault. Before leaving the question of divorce, I should like to distinguish two things which are very often confused. The Christian conception of marriage is one. The other is the quite different question: how far Christians, if they are voters or members of Parliament, ought to try to force their views of marriage on the rest of the community by embodying them in the divorce laws. A great many people seem to think that if you are a Christian yourself, you should try to make divorce difficult for everyone. I do not think that. At least I know I should be very angry if the Mohammedans tried to prevent the rest of us from drinking wine. My own view is that the churches should frankly recognize that the majority of British people are not Christians and therefore cannot be expected to live Christian lives. There ought to be two distinct kinds of marriage, one governed by the state with rules enforced on all citizens, and other governed by the church with rules enforced by her or her own members. The distinction ought to be quite sharp so that a man knows which couples are married in a Christian sense and which are not. So much for the Christian doctrine about the permanence of marriage. Something else, even more unpopular, remains to be dealt with. Christian wives promise to obey their husbands. In Christian marriage, the man is said to be the head. Two questions obviously arise here. Why should there be a head at all? Why not equality? Why should it be the man? The need for some head follows from the idea that marriage is permanent. Of course, as long as the husband and wife are agreed, no question of a head need arise, and we may hope that this will be the normal state of affairs in a Christian marriage. But when there is a real disagreement, what is to happen? Talk it over, of course, but I am assuming that they have done that and still failed to reach agreement. What do they do next? They cannot decide by majority vote, for in a council of two there can be no majority. Surely only one or other of two things can happen. Either they must separate and go their own ways, or else one or other of them must have a casting vote. If marriage is permanent, one or other party must, in the last resort, have the power of deciding the family policy. You cannot have a permanent association without a constitution. 2. If there must be a head, why the man? Well, firstly, is there any very serious wish that it should be the woman? As I have said, I am not married myself, but as far as I can see, even a woman who wants to be the head of her own house does not usually admire the same state of things when she finds it going on next door. She is much more likely to say, "Oh, poor Mr. X, why he allows that appalling woman to boss him around the way she does is more than I can imagine." I do not think she is even very flattered if anyone mentions the fact of her own headship. There must be something unnatural about the rule of wives over husbands, because the wives themselves are half ashamed of it and despise the husbands whom they rule. But there is also another reason, and here I speak quite frankly, as a bachelor, because it is a reason you can see from outside even better than from inside. The relations of the family to the outer world, what might be called its foreign policy, must depend in the last resort upon the man, because he always ought to be, and usually is, much more just to the outsiders. A woman is primarily fighting for her own children and husband against the rest of the world. Naturally, almost, in a sense, rightly, their claims override, for her, all other claims. She is the special trustee of their interests. The function of her husband is to see that this natural preference of hers is not given its head. He has the last word in order to protect other people from the intense family patriotism of the wife. If anyone doubts this, let me ask a simple question. If your dog has bitten the child next door, or if your child has hurt the dog next door, which would you sooner have to deal with, the master of the house or the mistress? Or if you are a married woman, let me ask you this question. Much as you admire your husband, would you not say that his chief failing is his tendency not to stick up for his rights and yours against the neighbors as vigorously as you would like? A bit of an appeaser. Okay. That's the end of those two chapters. There is quite a lot in both chapters that I don't agree with. But again, the point is I wasn't going to censor anything. I'm going to read it as it is. I try and call your attention once again to the fact that C.S. Lewis was a product of his time. It was a very different time. It is not the time of today. I would feel that in some cases he's quite right. In some cases, even if he doesn't quite realize it, he's actually kind of forward-looking on a couple of things from his time period. And in other ways, he is very much not. So let's try and talk about some of these things. There was actually something very early on in the first chapter of that we read tonight called Sexual Morality that I thought was really quite interesting, because it is quite I don't know, it's something that at least I thought of as a modern idea, and yet I feel he expresses it here quite well. And what he said was, that, he talks about how a girl in the Pacific Islands hardly wearing any clothes and a Victorian lady completely covered in clothes might both be equally modest, proper, or decent according to the standards of their own societies, and both, for all we could tell by their dress, might be equally chaste or equally unchaste. And that is the point I want to make here. There is this very, very unfortunate thing that has existed in cases of rape, for example, where there's this idea that, because someone, a young woman, dressed in a provocative way, maybe she was wearing a mini skirt or a low-cut top or whatever, that she is somehow asking for it, I believe is the way it's normally called, that she is, forgive my strong words here, a slut, or in British terms, a slag, a whore, any of these things. This is very, very wrong. And I actually think here that even though it was just one line, that C.S. Lewis is actually quite forward-looking to today by what he said. And that is that for all we could tell by their dress, they might be equally chaste or equally unchaste. You cannot tell by the way someone dresses what their, sexual mores are. If I wear long pants most of the time, it's not because I have anything against people who wear shorts, or that I think that it looks childish, or that I'm afraid that I'm being, trying to attract women with my very sexy legs. None of that. It's honestly just that I'm more comfortable in it. People dress in the way that they are most comfortable. If a woman is comfortable wearing a mini skirt and a low-cut top, that's fine. And it does not mark her out as a slut. It definitely does not mark her as asking for it. No one asks for violent sexual assault or harassment or rape. That is just completely ridiculous idea. It is one that has persisted for a very long time, unfortunately, in this world. And so I just wanted to use that line to kind of talk about it, because I think it's quite interesting that in a lot of ways, C.S. Lewis, in my opinion, with that line, was being very forward-looking, unlike quite a lot of the other things. He talks about chastity and all that. The other most important thing I would say about that first chapter of sexual morality is C.S. Lewis. Let's see. I have a comment here from Chris that, as the modern quippy line goes, it's a dress, not a yes. Exactly. That is exactly what I'm saying. The way someone dresses is not directly in relation to whether they want to have sexual relations with you or with any other person. And, it's a very wrong idea. And so, like I said, I think it's quite interesting that he was very forward-looking on this. So the other two things I want to mention here is in this sexual morality chapter, before we move to the second chapter, where there's a lot more to talk about, but in this sexual morality chapter, the other two things I want to mention is he says here, now this, I'm not sure that all denominations would necessarily agree with him on this, but I think this is a very, very important line here. Finally, though I have had to speak at some length about sex, I want to make it as clear as possible that the center of Christian morality is not here. If anyone thinks that Christians regard unchastity as the supreme vice, he is quite wrong. That is, in my opinion, completely correct. There is this belief, and I think in some places it's really more a sort of social thing than necessarily a religious thing, and it may be different in other denominations, but there's this thing that, Christians are remarkably, for people who are supposed to be chaste, are the ones who are remarkably obsessed with sex and what is going on in other people's bedrooms and what is going on and what is proper and right and so forth when it comes to sex. The point is that, if two consenting adults have sex outside of marriage, is that a sin? The Bible tells us it is. Now, if a man or a woman lies to someone else to get sex, or strings them along in such a way, and the result is that while they get the sexual relations, which may have been a sin, may or may not have been a sin, that's a different question, but that the whole thing is that they use the other person and leave the other person feeling used, hurt, and in pain. In my opinion, it is that the fact that they used them and left them in pain is a far worse sin than the actual physical act that occurred. And I think that's basically what he's saying here. All the worst pleasures are purely spiritual. The pleasure of putting other people in the wrong, of bossing and patronizing and spoiling sport, of backbiting, the pleasures of power and of hatred. So I think that is what he's saying here is, look, it's not that it's an unimportant thing, but it's definitely not the most important. I do feel, though, sometimes that some denominations, and maybe that's not even fair to say that an entire denomination, maybe it's just specific congregations or even maybe even specific people within them are that way. I also think, and I could be wrong about this, I think he's slightly wrong. There's a part in here, I'm not saying that I disagree with what he's saying, only that I'm not sure that everyone else agrees like the way he thinks they do. Let's see, here it is. Christianity is almost the only one of the great religions which thoroughly approves of the body, which believes that matter is good, that God himself once took on a human body, that some kind of body is going to be given to us and even in heaven. Okay. That is a very, very Anglican view, as I understand it to be. The fact that the body is good and that we can see this in the incarnation of Christ. The fact that he took on a human body shows that it is good. The body is good. But let us be completely clear. That has not been the view of Christianity, most likely for the majority of Christianity. There were pretty large sections of Christianity where, the body was bad. You don't get to things like self-flagellation with where you're whipping yourself, or the metal spike thing that some people used to use on their arms or legs to show their devotion to God. You don't get to that while thinking that the body is good. And I think that there are still a strong current, mainly the same people who will disagree with him saying that unchastity is not the supreme vice, are unlikely to believe that the body is naturally good. They will suggest that while created by God, that it is immediately a flawed creation because of the fall of humankind, and so that there is some sort of inherent evil or sinfulness within us that has to be tamed. I don't personally agree with that. I do not believe that the Anglican Church generally agrees with that, the Episcopal Church. I could be wrong. I haven't been to seminary. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that is at least what I understand it to be. Okay, we could just keep going all night on just that chapter, but for some reason I chose to read 2 chapters. We've been reading 2 chapters, but in this case, each chapter, frankly, had so much stuff in it to discuss that we could have greatly discussed both of them. I do like one thing here that in this Christian marriage chapter that C.S. Lewis says. And that thing is that at least he acknowledges that having not been married, his view may be flawed. Now, I'm not saying that his view is flawed specifically because that, but at least he acknowledges the possibility that his view is flawed for that reason. I have also not been married, so I will admit freely that my view may also be flawed through the lack of this experience. So I'm going to talk about this for a couple of things. First, I'm going to say another thing that I think that he has done very right here. So he says right here, this is towards the end, he's talking about divorce and so forth. Before leaving the question of divorce, I should like to distinguish two things which are often confused. The Christian conception of marriage is one. The other is the quite different question, which is how far Christians, if they are voters or members of parliament, ought to try to force their views of marriage on the rest of the community. That is, in my opinion, an excellent point. I think it goes very much to some of the arguments we have now about all sorts of things. Religious freedom. I am all for religious freedom. The problem is that religious freedom not only includes allowing Christians in this country, in the United States here, to believe what they believe and to practice what they practice. Freedom of religion, protection of religion also includes not oppressing other people. And if we impose our views and morality on everyone else, you get to a problem. A very good example. Early in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, we had in this country a very strong view by a lot of people, and some people still hold this view today, that alcohol is an inherently sinful or evil thing. Okay, that alcohol is a sinful, wrong thing, and that to drink alcohol is just a great and terrible sin. And those people formed the temperance movement, and they ultimately were able to gain enough influence as to impose prohibition across the whole of the United States. Essentially, they ended the legal sale of alcohol throughout the country. Never more than anywhere else is this a clear example of imposing your morals upon other people. What I would say to those who suggest that gay marriage is imposing the morals of other people on Christians, I disagree with that. The legality of gay marriage, for example, is... that's all it is. It is a legality, okay? There is no part of anything that the Supreme Court or any other law in this country did that forces any church to marry someone. So there is nothing that forces a Catholic church or a Baptist church or a Presbyterian church or any other church to marry someone. You cannot be oppressed. Your religious freedoms, in my opinion, are not being challenged by someone else being able to do something that you think is wrong. They become challenged. You're suppressing other people's religious beliefs when you are restricting things. Allowing things is not oppression. Restricting things is. That's my opinion on that. It may be controversial. I don't know. Now let's come to the very, very controversial last bit of this chapter. The Christian wives promise to obey their husbands. Okay. So I'm going to take a moment here to brag on the Episcopal Church, of which I am part. So right here in front of me I have, this is a copy of the Book of Common Prayer, 1979. From this all services, from communion on Sunday to baptisms to funerals, this book is the basis of all those services. And we have in our so this is, what is that, 1979, so 20, 30, like almost 40, is it 40? It might be 40 years ago. It is, I think 40 years ago, is when this book was made. And we come here to the part of the marriage, and we have the woman facing the man and saying, "In the name of God, I, whoever they are, take you, whoever the husband is, to be my husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until we are parted by death." You know what you didn't hear there? You did not hear a promise to obey. It was a different world. I disagree with him. I understand where he's coming from. I also would say that if there is any part of this that really shows that he is a bachelor not married, that this seems to be the part to me that is that way. I understand some of the things he's saying. This bit about how, someone has to have a casting vote. I'm not really sure I agree. I guess it depends on what you're talking about. I can foresee instances where that might be necessary, but I can foresee far more where it's not. So this is kind of ridiculous. And this idea of, is there any serious wish that a woman should be the head? It doesn't matter. I think that these traditional, very old-fashioned, in my views of marriage are part of what leads to the situation where women who wish to have a career instead of to prioritize a career instead of immediately getting married and have children are sometimes looked down on, and that men who may be better suited within their specific family to allowing their wife to have her career. Maybe her career earns more money, and instead the father becomes a stay-at-home father. Those people often get denigrated, and that is wrong. I'm not sure how else to put it. I think this whole section of this chapter is wrong. Perhaps someone out there who's married wants to agree or disagree with me, but I would like to point that out. So what he said right here is not trying to impose our views. I think that carries over to things other than divorce, other than marriage. That being said, I do understand some of the things he says. He is correct as far as I understand things to be. And again, if you're married and you disagree with me, please feel free to comment. I would look forward to any comments like that. But, I completely agree that this idea that you're going to be in love, this infatuation, for the whole of a lifetime is a completely ridiculous idea. Love changes over time. That doesn't mean you don't still love each other. It just changes. I also disagree that there are not situations in which it is completely justified to divorce, and sometimes it's very regrettable. I know that my understanding of the way the Episcopal Church, and I believe possibly the Church of England and most other Anglican churches these days, looks at these things, is that the important part is that you need to at least believe and intend fully your promise to mean something. And what they mean by that is, if you have divorced, they're probably going to ask you to do some sort of counseling before you marry someone else, because they're going to want you to still understand that you're making a promise for life. Now, church generally, as I understand it, these days accepts and understands that things happen. Things happen. Life changes. Life gets in the way, and sometimes things don't work out perfectly, and for various reasons, people feel that they can no longer live together. I'm not sure that always results in divorce. I think it often does. I think that him kind of dismissing it as, this very flighty, oh, I'm not in love anymore, let's get a divorce. I'm not sure that's exactly how it works. I'm sure there are some people out there that is how it has worked for. But I think most of the time there's probably a bit more thought that goes into it than that. I don't think it's simply a we're not in love anymore sort of thing. But again, if you're been married and divorced, you can feel free to comment and disagree with me. I'm not going to be angry. Again, this is not an area I personally have experience in, so it is hard for me to completely understand, at least from experience. What I have and know comes from outside looking in. But like I said, what I'll say is that I think that he is completely wrong on the bit about men and women. I think it is a marriage of equals. The casting vote thing, I don't know. The problem is that probably maybe those situations do arise where someone has to have the casting vote, but maybe it doesn't have to be the same person every time, if that makes some sort of sense. But I don't know. I don't know. I haven't been in that situation. I haven't been married, so it's difficult for me to say. So I appreciate you watching. Our next episode will be on a Wednesday, which I believe is we're on Wednesday now. We'll be on Saturday, not Wednesday, which is the 17th. And we will be reading, I believe, 2 more chapters. Let's see. 2 more chapters. We have a couple chapters coming up soon where we'll be reading 3, but I don't think it's this next episode. I think the next episode is still just 1. Yes, so on the next episode on Wednesday, we will be reading chapters 7 and 8 of Book 3, which are entitled Forgiveness and the Great Sin. So we'll be looking at that. I hope you join me for that. Thank you, Chris, for commenting. Feel free to add any other comment before I wrap up if you want. Tell me whether I'm totally wrong on the marriage thing. That's, you let me know. But that's the way I see it. I think there are some things here where C.S. Lewis actually had some interesting forward-looking ideas, but there was a lot of stuff in here in these 2 chapters that I disagreed with. I think chastity is an ideal and probably one we should strive to. What I agree with him on is it's not the end-all be-all of Christianity, and with all of Christianity, let's remember that whatever you have done, you can be forgiven. So there's, a view sometimes that a real Christian wouldn't do X or Y or Z, and I'm afraid I don't agree with that, because real Christians are still humans, and humans are flawed, and we fail. So chastity is probably the ideal, as I currently consider it to be, but people should not be condemned for failing it. And I actually kind of agree with him that if you are not intending on making a whole life promise, then yeah, it's probably better to live in sin, so to speak, than it is to get married and break the promise. That seems to be true to me. But I think we've moved out of the part of the book where we get these highly kind of questionable views from C.S. Lewis. I think most of the rest of the book, I'll keep doing my warning each week just in case it comes up again. But anyway, so that's it. I want to thank you for watching this evening, and you all have a good evening, and I hope to see you again on Saturday, and hopefully some people decide to comment. That would be great. I do thank Chris for commenting this evening. All right, thank you very much, and have a great evening.